Do you have any pizza left from yesterday, sir? Behind the counter, an employee in a gray apron glanced down at her. What did you say? He asked. Annie swallowed. I was wondering, she said shyly, if maybe you have any pizza left from yesterday. The employee leaned against the counter and sighed. If you want pizza, he said plainly, you take money out and buy it. He tapped the glass case. This is a pizza shop, kid, not a place where we hand out free food. Annie nodded quickly. I know, she said. Her voice was polite, respectful. I don't have any money. The employee looked at her again, then shook his head. Well, that makes it simple. Annie hurried to explain, as if afraid the conversation might end before she finished. Yesterday's pizza is okay, she said quickly. Or even just the pieces that fall off the trays. She pointed timidly toward the metal pans where fresh pizzas were baked. Sometimes there are crumbs left. The man rubbed his forehead. You kids always say that, he muttered. Annie lowered her head slightly but continued speaking. My mom isn't feeling well, she said softly. And my little brother, his name is Marcus. The employee lifted his hand, stopping her. Hey, he said, not angrily, but firmly. Don't start telling me stories. Annie froze. The man leaned forward a little, lowering his voice. You come in here almost every day asking the same thing. His tone wasn't cruel, just tired. And every day there's a reason. A brother. A sick mom. Something. A few customers in line shifted uncomfortably. The employee sighed again and shook his head. Look, kid, I'm not saying you're lying. I'm just saying this isn't how stores work. He gestured around the shop. If we start giving food away every time someone asks, we won't have a business left. Annie didn't argue. She simply nodded. I understand. She stepped back from the counter. Behind her stood a tall man holding a cup of black coffee. He had been listening quietly the entire time. Daniel Whitmore. He was the founder of Whitmore Pizza, the very company whose logo hung above the door of the shop they were standing in. Daniel rarely visited his restaurants anymore. His days were usually spent in conference rooms downtown, surrounded by executives and financial reports. But that morning he had stopped at this South Side location unexpectedly, and now he stood in line, watching a little girl ask for crumbs. Annie spoke once more, quietly. It's okay, she said. Her voice carried no anger, only acceptance. I'll come back another day. She turned slowly, preparing to leave. Behind her, Daniel felt something stir inside his chest. It wasn't a feeling he welcomed. Pity was something he had trained himself to ignore years ago. His father had once told him something Daniel never forgot. No one gives you anything in this world, the old man used to say. If you want something, you take it. Daniel Whitmore had built an empire believing exactly that. But watching the small girl standing quietly in front of the counter made that belief feel incomplete. Before he realized he was moving, Daniel stepped forward. Give her a pizza. The employee turned. Sir, Daniel placed a folded bill on the counter. Actually, he said calmly, give her two. The employee blinked. Then he recognized the man standing in front of him. Oh, Mr. Whitmore, I didn't realize. That's fine, Daniel said quietly. He nodded toward Annie. Just make sure she gets something warm. The employee quickly grabbed a pizza box and slid a fresh pie from the warming rack. Steam rose from the slices as he closed the lid and set the box on the counter. Annie looked up slowly. Daniel crouched slightly so their eyes were level. You asked for yesterday's pizza, he said gently, but today's will taste better. Annie hesitated before taking the box. Thank you, sir. Her voice was sincere, but careful, like someone who had learned that kindness sometimes disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Daniel expected her to open the box immediately. Instead, Annie lifted the lid just long enough to look at the slices inside. Then she closed it again, carefully. She slid the pizza box into the worn backpack on her shoulders. Daniel frowned slightly. You're not going to eat? Annie shook her head. It's for my mom. She paused. And Marcus. Something inside Daniel shifted again. He watched as Annie walked toward the door. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. Then the older cashier beside the oven leaned over and spoke quietly. That girl comes in here every week. Daniel turned. She does? The man nodded. Always asking for yesterday's pizza. He shrugged. Never eats it here. Daniel glanced toward the window. Outside, Annie's small figure moved slowly down the sidewalk. Something about that little girl standing there asking for crumbs had reached into a memory he had buried long ago. Without another word, he placed his untouched coffee on the counter. Then he pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cold wind hit him immediately. Down the street, Annie was already several steps ahead. and for reasons he could not yet explain. The billionaire began walking after her. Annie walked quickly once she stepped outside the pizza shop. Daniel Whitmore followed her from a distance. He told himself he was only making sure she got home safely. That was the explanation he preferred. But if he was honest, he knew something else had already begun pulling him forward. Annie never once looked behind her. Daniel stayed half a block away, walking slowly so the distance between them never disappeared. The billionaire of Whitmore Pizza, whose name was printed above hundreds of storefronts across the Midwest, had never imagined that one morning he would find himself quietly following a little girl through the south side of Chicago. But he kept walking. The streets here had a tired look, paint peeled from older buildings. Sidewalk cracks held thin layers of gray snow that had frozen overnight. A pair of older men stood outside a convenience store drinking coffee from paper cups and arguing softly about the Chicago Bears. Annie turned left at the next intersection. Daniel slowed as he reached the corner. From here, the street looked narrower, lined with aging apartment buildings that had seen better decades. Iron railings rusted along the stairs, and some windows had cardboard taped inside the glass. Annie walked straight to the third building from the end of the block. She climbed the concrete steps carefully, pushing the door open with her shoulder before slipping inside. Daniel stopped across the street. For a moment, he simply stood there. This was the point where a sensible person would turn around. A man with his reputation, his schedule, his responsibilities, he had no business standing in front of a rundown apartment building watching a child go home. Yet his feet carried him forward anyway. He crossed the street. The building door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of radiator heat, old paint, and something cooking 2 floors up. The lighting was dim, and one of the ceiling fixtures flickered weakly. Daniel paused. Upstairs, he could hear small footsteps moving quickly along the floorboards. He followed quietly. The stairs groaned slightly beneath his weight. So he moved carefully, placing each step near the edges of the boards. The second-floor hallway stretched ahead of him in a narrow line of worn carpet and chipped paint. At the far end, Annie stopped at a door labeled 2B. She struggled briefly with the key before the lock clicked open. Daniel quickly stepped back toward the corner before she could see him. The door opened, then closed. For a few seconds, the hallway was silent. Daniel moved closer, not directly to the door, but close enough to hear. The walls in old buildings had a way of carrying sound. Through the narrow crack where the doorframe met the wall, voices slipped out clearly enough for someone standing nearby. Inside the apartment, Annie spoke first. "Marcus, slow down," she said gently. A small boy's voice answered immediately. "You got pizza?" "Yes," Annie said. There was a pause, then the sound of cardboard opening. Daniel could almost picture the scene without seeing it. "Wow," the boy whispered. "Wait," Annie said softly. "Let's give Mom first." A woman coughed. The sound was deep and rough, the kind of cough that seemed to scrape against the lungs on the way out. Daniel felt his shoulders stiffen. Then he heard the woman's voice, weak but warm. "Annie, where did you get that?" "The pizza shop," Annie answered. "You didn't spend money we don't have, did you?" "No," Annie said quickly. "They gave it to me." There was another cough. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't keep asking them for food." Annie's voice grew quiet. "I only asked for yesterday's pizza." Daniel leaned slightly closer to the door. Inside, Marcus laughed softly. "This one smells better than yesterday." "That's because it's fresh," Annie said. Then she added something that made Daniel's chest tighten. "The man at the shop bought it." There was a short silence. "Did you thank him?" the mother asked. "Yes." Another cough followed, longer this time. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He had heard that sound before. Years ago, on a winter night, he had almost forgotten. Inside the apartment, Annie spoke again. "Mom, you should eat." "I'm not hungry," the woman replied. "You say that every time," Annie said quietly. A small rustling sound followed, as if Annie were placing the pizza into someone's hands. Marcus's voice spoke again. "Mom, Annie said my name at the shop." "What do you mean?" the woman asked. "She told the man about me." Annie quickly interrupted. "I didn't tell him anything bad." "I know," the woman said softly. Then she added something that made Daniel's breath stop. "You always try to take care of everyone first." The woman coughed again. When she spoke next, her voice sounded even weaker. "You remind me of someone I met a long time ago." Daniel felt his heart beat harder. "Someone who needed help," the woman continued slowly. "Someone who was standing in the cold just like you were." Daniel's hand pressed against the wall beside the door. He knew that story. He had lived it. Inside the apartment, Annie asked quietly, Did you help him? Yes. Did he say thank you? There was a small pause. Then the woman answered. He did. Daniel leaned toward the crack beside the door. Through the narrow gap, he could finally see inside the apartment. A small living room, a worn couch, a thin blanket, and the woman sitting against the cushions. Her face was older now, thinner, but the moment the light from the window touched her features, Daniel Whitmore felt the past crash into the present. He knew her. Sarah Johnson. 15 years ago, she had opened her door to a freezing young man who had nothing left. And now her daughter was knocking on pizza shop counters asking for crumbs. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because we love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe kindness still matters in this world, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories that remind us what humanity really looks like. Daniel stepped back from the door slowly. The hallway light flickered again above his head. For a long moment he simply stood there, staring at the floor. The woman who had once saved him was now struggling to breathe inside a cold apartment, and her 6-year-old daughter was trying to keep the family alive with leftover pizza. For the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore felt something he had not allowed himself to feel: shame, and the quiet, growing certainty that this morning was about to change his life. Daniel Whitmore did not leave the hallway immediately. He stood there in the dim light outside apartment 2B, his hand still resting against the peeling wall beside the door. The old fluorescent bulb above him flickered again, buzzing faintly as if it too were tired of holding itself together. Inside the apartment, he could hear small movements: the rustle of a cardboard box, the quiet clink of a plate, a child's voice trying to whisper and failing. Annie, can I have another slice? Not yet, Annie replied gently. Mom needs to eat first. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered that voice. Not Annie's, her mother's, Sarah Johnson. 15 years ago, the voice had been stronger, younger, confident in the calm way of someone used to helping others before helping herself. He remembered the night clearly now. Chicago winter, snow falling sideways, his body shaking from hunger and exhaustion after 2 days without proper food. He had collapsed near the entrance of a small grocery store on the west side. Most people had walked past. One woman had stopped, Sarah Johnson. She had helped him stand, half carrying him into the warmth of her apartment building lobby. He remembered the smell of soup, the scratchy blanket she had wrapped around his shoulders, and the sentence she had said while placing a bowl of hot food in front of him. Everyone deserves one more chance. Daniel had never forgotten those words, but he had forgotten her face. Until this morning, inside the apartment, another cough echoed. Stronger this time. Daniel opened his eyes. Through the small crack beside the doorframe, he could see Annie kneeling beside the sofa. She held a slice of pizza carefully with both hands, offering it toward her mother. Mom, please eat, Annie said softly. I'm fine, Sarah replied weakly. You always say that, Annie answered. Marcus spoke next. I ate mine already. Daniel could hear the smile in the boy's voice. Slow down, Annie said. I was hungry. I know. Daniel shifted slightly, careful not to make noise. The apartment looked small from what he could see through the crack in the door. The couch was worn, its fabric faded from years of use. A thin blanket covered Sarah's legs. Beside the couch stood a small table with a glass of water and a bottle of medicine that was nearly empty. Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor, chewing happily. Children had a way of finding joy even in places where adults saw only problems. Annie finally placed the slice of pizza into her mother's hands. Just a little, she insisted. Sarah sighed quietly. You should be eating, not me. I will, Annie said. Marcus suddenly looked toward the door. For a moment, Daniel thought the boy had somehow seen him through the crack, but Marcus only pointed at the pizza box. There's still more. Yes, Annie replied. We'll save some for later. Daniel felt a tightness growing in his chest. He had built an empire selling pizza. Hundreds of stores, thousands of employees, millions of slices every year. And yet here, less than 3 miles from his corporate headquarters, a 6-year-old girl was carefully rationing slices like they were winter supplies. Inside the apartment, Sarah spoke again, her voice thin with exhaustion. You shouldn't keep asking that shop for food. Annie looked down. I only asked for yesterday's pizza. I know. You said it was okay if we were polite. Sarah managed a faint smile. It is okay to ask, she said softly, but you must never beg. I didn't beg. I know. Marcus spoke again. That pizza was better than yesterday's. Annie laughed quietly. That's because it was fresh. Sarah looked at her daughter. Did someone give it to you? Yes. Who? A man. What man? The one standing behind me in line. Sarah studied Annie's face. Did you thank him? Yes. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs slowly. Through the small opening beside the door, he watched Sarah lift the pizza slice with shaky hands. She took a small bite, chewing slowly as if even eating required effort. The cough returned again a few seconds later. Daniel stepped back from the door. He suddenly felt like an intruder. For years, he had believed that distance was strength, that keeping problems far away allowed a person to succeed without distraction. But standing in that hallway, listening to the quiet struggle inside apartment 2B, that belief began to feel fragile. He walked slowly back toward the stairwell. Each step felt heavier than the one before it. At the bottom of the stairs, he stopped beside the building entrance. The cold wind pushed against the door from outside. Daniel rested his hand against the metal frame. 15 years ago, he had been the one standing in the cold. Sarah Johnson had opened a door for him. She had given him warmth, food, and a chance to rebuild his life. Now she was sick in a failing apartment while her daughter searched pizza shops for leftovers. Daniel stepped outside. The wind cut across the street again, carrying the smell of traffic in winter. Across the block, a small grocery store opened its doors for the day. A delivery truck backed into an alley. Life continued moving, unaware of the quiet story unfolding inside one aging apartment building. Daniel looked back once toward the second-floor windows. Behind that glass lived the woman who had once saved him, and 2 children who now depended on her strength. A thought settled in his mind slowly. Not a plan. Not yet, but something close. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. For a long moment, he stared at the screen without dialing, because for the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore understood something clearly. Money had built his success, but gratitude might decide what kind of man he became next. Daniel Whitmore did not drive back downtown that morning. Instead, he remained seated in his car across the street from the apartment building for nearly 20 minutes, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel while the engine idled softly. The heater hummed, pushing warm air through the vents, but he barely noticed it. His eyes stayed on the building. Second floor, left window, apartment 2B. Through the thin curtains, he could see movement occasionally, shadows shifting across the pale fabric when Annie passed through the small living room. Daniel had spent most of his adult life making decisions quickly. That had been one of the reasons people trusted him with money, with companies, with expansion plans worth millions. In business, hesitation was expensive. Clarity was power. But this decision felt different. This was not a boardroom calculation. This was something older, something heavier. He leaned back against the leather seat and closed his eyes briefly. 15 years earlier, Sarah Johnson had not asked questions before helping him. She had not demanded proof that he deserved her kindness. She had simply opened the door, and now he had the chance to do the same. Daniel reached for his phone again. This time he dialed. The call connected almost immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," a calm voice answered. Daniel's assistant, Linda Park, had worked with him for nearly 10 years. She had the rare ability to sound both professional and quietly human at the same time. "Linda," Daniel said. "Yes, sir. I need the name of the best pulmonary specialist in Chicago." There was a brief pause. "For yourself, sir?" "No." Another pause. Shorter this time. "I'll have a list in 5 minutes." "Not a list," Daniel replied. "The best one." "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." The call ended. Daniel set the phone down and looked back toward the apartment building. Snow had begun falling again, thin flakes drifting slowly across the street like dust in sunlight. A few minutes later, Annie appeared in the second-floor window. She was holding Marcus. The boy clung to her shoulders while she pointed at something outside, probably the snow. Marcus laughed. Even through the glass, Daniel could see the brightness of that small moment. For a child, snow still meant magic. For adults, it meant cold apartments and higher heating bills. Daniel's phone vibrated. He answered. "I have a name," Linda said. "Dr. Henry Caldwell, Northwestern Memorial, head of pulmonary medicine. Is he working today?" "Yes. Call his office," Daniel said. "Tell him I need him to see someone." Linda hesitated. "Is this a private matter?" "Yes. I'll arrange it." Daniel ended the call. He stepped out of the car. The wind caught his coat immediately, tugging at the fabric as he crossed the street toward the building entrance. This time he did not hesitate. The hallway smelled the same as before, radiator heat and old plaster. He climbed the stairs slowly. When he reached the second floor, he stopped outside apartment 2B. For a moment he listened again. Inside, he could hear Marcus laughing and Annie speaking quietly to him. Then the cough returned, longer this time. Daniel lifted his hand and knocked. The sound was gentle but clear. Inside the apartment, everything went quiet. Footsteps approached. The door opened halfway. Annie stood there. For a second, she simply stared at him. Recognition spread slowly across her face. "You're the man from the pizza shop," she said. Daniel nodded. "Good morning, Annie." She looked surprised that he knew her name. "You followed me?" Her voice carried no accusation, only curiosity. Daniel smiled faintly. "I wanted to make sure you got home safely." Annie considered that explanation carefully, the way children do when deciding whether adults are telling the truth. Before she could answer, Sarah's voice came from inside the apartment. "Annie? Who is it?" Annie stepped aside slightly. "It's the man from the pizza shop." There was a short silence. Then Sarah spoke again. "Please, let him come in." Daniel entered the apartment. The room was small but clean. A narrow couch stood against one wall, a second-hand coffee table in front of it. The kitchen area consisted of a single counter, a sink, and a small stove that looked older than Annie. Marcus watched Daniel cautiously from the floor. Daniel crouched slightly. "Marcus, right?" The boy nodded slowly. Daniel smiled. "I'm Daniel." Marcus studied him for another moment, then returned to playing with the pizza box lid. Daniel turned toward the couch. Sarah Johnson sat upright now, though the effort clearly cost her. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders slightly, and her breathing sounded strained. Up close, the years were visible in her face, but Daniel still recognized her. She studied him carefully. Then her eyes widened. For a moment she said nothing. Then she spoke his name quietly. "Daniel?" He nodded. Sarah leaned back slightly, almost in disbelief. "You made it," she said softly. The exact same words she had spoken 15 years earlier when he woke up in her apartment. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "Because of you," he replied. Annie looked between them in confusion. "You know each other?" Sarah smiled faintly. "A long time ago," she said, her voice thin but warm. Marcus looked up again. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Sarah laughed weakly. "No, sweetheart." Daniel stepped closer. "You helped me once," he said gently. "Now it's my turn." Sarah shook her head slowly. "You don't owe me anything." Daniel glanced toward Annie and Marcus. "I think I do." He pulled a chair closer to the couch. "First," he said calmly, "we're getting you to a doctor." Sarah opened her mouth to protest. Daniel raised a hand slightly. "The best one in the city." For the first time since entering the apartment, Marcus grinned. "Doctors give stickers." Annie looked at Daniel carefully. "Will it cost a lot?" Daniel met her eyes. "Not for you." Outside the window, snow continued falling quietly across Chicago. Inside the small apartment, something had begun to change, and for the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore felt certain he was finally repaying a debt that had waited far too long. Sarah Johnson agreed to the doctor only after Annie asked her twice. That was the part Daniel noticed most. Not the fear in Sarah's eyes when he mentioned a hospital. Not the instinctive pride that made her want to refuse help she clearly needed. It was the way her resistance softened the moment Annie touched her arm and said, very quietly, "Please, Mom." That one word carried more force than any argument Daniel could have made. "All right," Sarah said at last, though the answer came out with a cough at the end. "All right." Annie let out a breath she had clearly been holding in for days. Marcus, still seated on the floor with the pizza box lid in his lap, looked up and smiled as though all difficult decisions could be solved that simply. "Do I get to come too?" he asked. Sarah managed a small smile. "You always come too." Daniel took out his phone and texted Linda Park one line. "Need a car here now. Also winter coats for 2 children." The reply came almost instantly. On it, he slipped the phone back into his coat and looked around the apartment again, this time more carefully. The place was even smaller up close than it had seemed through the cracked hallway door. The radiator beneath the window looked old enough to belong in a museum. And though it hissed faintly, it clearly wasn't doing much. The kitchen sink held only 2 plates, 1 cup, and a saucepan. A laundry basket in the corner was folded neatly with clothes that had been washed and mended too many times. On the windowsill sat a jar with pencils, 2 crayons, and a single artificial flower faded by sunlight. Everything in the room said the same thing. Someone had been trying very hard to hold a life together with almost nothing. Daniel had seen wealth displayed in every form: careless wealth, inherited wealth, loud wealth, secret wealth. But there was a different dignity in a room where every object had been used carefully, repaired twice, and respected because there was no money to replace it. Annie had already moved into action. She pulled a small canvas bag from under the coffee table and began placing things inside with quick, efficient motions. A bottle of medicine, a folded scarf, a pair of socks for Marcus, a worn envelope of papers tied with a rubber band. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you always pack for your mother?" Annie didn't stop moving. "Mostly." "Mostly?" he repeated. She looked up briefly. "When she gets too tired." It was not a complaint. She said it with the plainness of a child stating the weather. Daniel felt a hard knot settle deeper in his chest. Sarah noticed the look on his face and gave a faint shake of her head. "She's had to grow up too fast," she said quietly. Her voice carried embarrassment, not self-pity. Daniel looked at Annie again. The girl was 6 years old and moved around that apartment like a second parent. He glanced toward Marcus. The boy had found one last crust inside the box and was eating it slowly, as if he understood that making food last was part of the day's work. A knock came at the door. Daniel crossed the room and opened it. Linda stood in the hallway beside a driver from the company. She held 2 new winter coats over one arm and a paper shopping bag in the other. Her expression did not change when she looked past Daniel into the apartment. That was one of the reasons he trusted her. She had the rare gift of seeing something difficult without turning it into theater. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Come in." Linda stepped inside and crouched immediately in front of Marcus and Annie, bringing herself down to their level instead of towering over them like most adults did. "Hi," she said gently. "I brought these for you." She held out the coats. One was dark blue, one was red. Marcus stared at them as though they had come from another planet. Annie didn't reach for hers right away. She looked first at her mother. Sarah gave a small nod. "Say thank you." "Thank you," Annie said softly. Marcus clutched the red coat to his chest. "This one's mine?" "It is now," Linda said. He smiled so brightly that Daniel had to turn away for a second. There was something about children receiving what should have been ordinary necessities: warm coats, decent shoes, enough food that made the world look more broken, not less. The driver stepped in next. "We're ready when you are, sir." Daniel nodded. He turned to Sarah. "Can you stand?" "With help." Annie moved at once, but Daniel gently stopped her with one hand. "I've got her." He knelt beside the sofa. "Sarah?" She looked at him for a long moment, and in that pause something passed silently between them. Memory, pride, reluctance, gratitude, maybe all of it at once. Then she placed her hand in his. It startled him how light she felt when he helped her rise. 15 years ago, she had steadied him in a winter doorway when he'd been too weak to stand on his own. Back then, her grip had been firm, certain. Today, her fingers trembled, and every step she took looked borrowed from some deeper reserve she had almost spent. Annie grabbed the bag of papers and medicine. Marcus put on his red coat backwards. Linda quietly turned it around for him without saying a word. For one brief second, Sarah laughed. It was a weak laugh, interrupted by another cough, but it changed the room. Even sickness could not fully erase the woman Daniel remembered. He helped Sarah toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back at the apartment. Not dramatically. Not the way people look at a place they are sure they will never see again. This was different. The look of a mother counting what had been left behind. "Annie," she said, "did you unplug the hot plate?" "Yes." "And the bathroom light?" "Yes." Marcus lifted a mittenless hand. "I didn't touch anything." Sarah smiled faintly. "I know, baby." They moved slowly down the hallway, Daniel supporting Sarah on one side while Annie walked close enough to catch whatever might fall, though there was nothing in her small arms strong enough to carry that burden. Still, she stayed close. Children like Annie always stayed close. They learned early that love often looked like vigilance. Outside, the cold hit them immediately. The company sedan waited at the curb. Marcus stopped short when he saw it. "Is that a limo?" Daniel almost smiled. "No," he said, "just a car." Marcus looked unconvinced. The driver opened the rear door. Linda guided Annie and Marcus inside first. Daniel helped Sarah lower herself carefully onto the seat, then got in beside her. As the car pulled away from the curb, Annie turned and looked back at the apartment building through the rear window. Daniel noticed that. "Did you forget something?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." "Then what are you looking at?" Annie took a moment before answering. "I just like to know it's still there." The sentence was simple, but it stayed with him all the way downtown. At Northwestern Memorial, Everything happened quickly after that. The emergency intake staff recognized Daniel Whitmore immediately, though to their credit they were discreet about it. Forms appeared. A wheelchair arrived. A nurse in navy scrubs asked practiced questions in a voice that was both efficient and kind. "How long has the cough been going on?" Sarah tried to answer, but Annie spoke first. "Since before Christmas." The nurse paused and looked down at her. "And the fever?" "On and off," Annie said. "Mostly at night." Daniel looked at the girl. She had the exactness of a child who had spent too long paying attention because no adult around her could afford not to. They took Sarah through double doors a few minutes later. Before disappearing inside, she reached for Annie's hand. "Stay with Marcus." "I will." Sarah looked at Daniel next. There was still pride in her gaze, and some worry. But now there was also trust, reluctant and fragile, like something taken out of storage after years of disuse. "Thank you," she said. Daniel shook his head once. "You don't owe me that." But she had already been wheeled away. Annie stood still for several seconds after the doors closed. Marcus tugged on her sleeve. "When's Mom coming back?" Annie swallowed. "Soon." It was the kind of answer children gave one another when the truth was too large to hold. Daniel looked at the two of them, one in a red coat too new for him to stop touching, the other standing straight-backed with fear hidden under responsibility, and understood with uncomfortable clarity that this morning had already crossed a line. He was no longer helping strangers. He was stepping into a debt, and somewhere deep inside, a voice he had ignored for years began to whisper that perhaps debt and gratitude were not weaknesses at all. Hospitals have a way of slowing time. In the waiting area outside the pulmonary unit at Northwestern Memorial, the clock on the wall seemed to move differently than clocks anywhere else in the city. Every minute felt longer. Every sound carried farther. Daniel Whitmore sat in a chair near the window, his coat folded beside him. The winter sunlight filtered through the glass, pale and quiet against the polished floor. Across from him, Annie sat beside Marcus. Marcus had discovered that the hospital chairs rolled slightly if you pushed them with your feet. For several minutes he entertained himself by sliding forward and back in tiny movements. "Marcus," Annie said gently. "Don't do that." He stopped, then 2 seconds later tried again. "Marcus." "Okay." Daniel almost smiled. Children adapted to waiting in ways adults never quite learned. A nurse passed through the hallway pushing a cart of supplies. Another family sat several chairs away, speaking quietly in Spanish. A television mounted near the ceiling played muted news footage about traffic on the Kennedy Expressway. Normal city life. But inside the double doors where Sarah had been taken, the world had narrowed to test results and medical decisions. Annie's hands rested quietly in her lap. Daniel noticed that she wasn't fidgeting the way most children her age would. She simply watched the doors. "How long have you been taking care of your mom?" he asked gently. Annie looked at him. "A long time." How long is a long time? She thought about that. "Since last winter." "What happened last winter?" "She got sick." The words were calm, matter of fact. Daniel nodded slowly. "And before that?" "She worked at the grocery store." "Did you like that job?" Annie gave a small shrug. She was tired a lot. Marcus leaned toward Daniel suddenly. "Mom used to bring home cookies." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Free cookies?" Marcus shook his head. "Broken ones." That made Daniel smile for real. Annie nodded. "The bakery sent the broken ones to the store." Marcus leaned back proudly. "They still tasted good." A few seconds later he added, very seriously, "Better sometimes." Annie looked back toward the hospital doors. "Mom said we shouldn't waste food." Daniel heard the echo of Sarah's voice in that sentence. A nurse approached them. "Are you Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes. Dr. Caldwell will speak with you now." Daniel stood. He looked at Annie. "Stay here with Marcus." She nodded immediately. "We will." The nurse guided him down the hallway and through the double doors into a quieter section of the hospital. Dr. Henry Caldwell waited near a glass office overlooking the winter skyline. He was in his early 60s, tall, with silver hair and the steady posture of someone who had spent decades delivering both good and bad news. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. Daniel shook it. "How is she?" Dr. Caldwell motioned toward the office. "Let's sit." They stepped inside. Daniel remained standing. The doctor studied him for a moment before speaking. "Your friend is very sick." Daniel didn't flinch. "What are we dealing with?" Dr. Caldwell folded his hands. "Severe pneumonia complicated by untreated lung infection." "How long?" "Months. Possibly longer." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Can you treat it?" "Yes." The doctor paused. But treatment will not be simple. Daniel waited. She's malnourished, exhausted. Her immune system has been under strain for too long. Recovery will take time and proper care. Daniel nodded. Then we'll give her both. Dr. Caldwell watched him carefully. Do you know this woman well? Daniel hesitated. Not well enough. The doctor leaned back slightly. Most people who bring someone into my unit don't stay. Daniel understood the meaning behind that sentence. They pay the bill, Dr. Caldwell continued quietly, and disappear. Daniel looked through the window toward the city. Chicago stretched across the horizon, steel and glass shining under winter light. Somewhere beyond those buildings stood the apartment where Annie had carefully divided pizza slices the night before. I'm not disappearing, Daniel said. Dr. Caldwell studied him for a few seconds longer. Then he nodded. Good. The doctor stood. We've started antibiotics and oxygen therapy. The next 48 hours are important. Daniel finally sat down. Can she see her children? For a few minutes. Dr. Caldwell opened the office door. But not yet. She needs rest first. They walked back into the hallway. Outside the waiting area, Annie immediately stood. Marcus was half asleep against her shoulder. What did the doctor say? She asked. Daniel crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. He said, your mom is strong. Is she going to be okay? Daniel didn't answer right away. Children like Annie deserved honesty, but they also deserved hope. He's going to help her get better, Daniel said. Annie studied his face. She seemed to measure whether that sentence contained truth. Finally, she nodded. Marcus woke up just enough to ask, Can we see her? Soon, Daniel said. The boy leaned his head back against Annie's shoulder again. A few minutes later, Linda Park arrived. She carried 2 paper bags and a tablet tucked under her arm. Lunch, she said simply. She handed Annie a sandwich and a small bottle of milk. Marcus sat up immediately. Is that for me? It is. Within seconds, he was eating with the focus only hungry children possess. Annie took smaller bites. Daniel noticed that she still kept glancing toward the hospital doors. Linda sat beside him. I've arranged a private recovery room for Sarah Johnson, she said quietly, and a temporary apartment nearby if needed. Daniel nodded. Good. Linda hesitated. There's something else. What? She turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a photograph. A man in an expensive coat stood outside Whitmore Foods headquarters downtown. Daniel recognized him immediately. Victor Langley. Langley owned a rival food distribution company and had been trying for years to buy out several of Whitmore's restaurant suppliers. What does he want now? Daniel asked. Linda lowered her voice. He's been asking questions. About what? About you. Daniel frowned. Specifically, Linda continued, why you canceled 2 meetings this morning and spent the day at a hospital with a woman from a low-income housing block. Daniel looked back toward Annie and Marcus. Marcus had fallen asleep again with the sandwich still in his hand. Annie carefully wrapped the remaining half in a napkin so it could be saved for later. Let him ask, Daniel said quietly. Linda studied him. You know how people like Langley operate. Yes, they'll look for weaknesses. Daniel watched Annie for another moment. Then he turned back to Linda. For years, he said calmly, I believed compassion was a weakness. And now, Daniel leaned back in the hospital chair. Now I'm starting to think it might be the only strength that matters. Across the waiting room, Annie looked up and met his eyes. For a moment, she gave him a small, uncertain smile, and Daniel Whitmore realized that somewhere between the pizza shop and the hospital hallway, the direction of his life had already begun to change. Sarah Johnson opened her eyes just after sunset. By then, the hospital room had changed color. The pale winter light that had filled it earlier was gone, replaced by the muted gold of lamps and the soft green glow of monitors. The city beyond the wide window had turned into a field of distant lights scattered across the dark. Daniel Whitmore was sitting in the chair beside her bed when she stirred. He had told himself he would leave after making sure the children were settled. He had told himself there were calls to return, decisions waiting downtown. A company that did not pause simply because one memory had walked back into his life. But he had stayed. Now he rose quietly as Sarah blinked against the light. For a few seconds she looked disoriented, caught somewhere between fever and waking. Then her gaze found him, and recognition settled in slowly. Daniel, she said. Her voice was weaker than it had been in the apartment, but clearer. He stepped closer. How are you feeling? She gave the faintest hint of a smile, like somebody parked a truck on my chest. Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That sounds promising. It means I'm awake enough to complain. That does sound promising. Sarah shifted slightly against the pillows. Even that small movement seemed to tire her. How long was I asleep? A few hours. And the kids? They ate. Marcus fell asleep twice. Annie didn't want to leave the waiting room until the nurse promised she could see you. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, relief moving across her face in a quiet wave. She worries too much. Daniel looked at her for a moment before answering. She worries exactly as much as she thinks she has to. Sarah opened her eyes again. The truth of that sat between them without softness. Outside the door, hospital sounds moved on distant footsteps, a rolling cart, voices lowered by habit. But inside the room, everything felt still. Sarah looked toward the window. Funny, she murmured. What is? I spent months trying not to end up in a hospital because I knew I couldn't pay for it. She turned her head slowly back toward him. And now, I'm in a room bigger than my apartment. Daniel said nothing. I know this isn't charity, she added after a pause. Or at least I don't think it is. No, he said quietly. It isn't. Sarah studied him. You remembered. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded once. Not at first. That seemed to amuse her. You forgot the woman who saved your life? I forgot her face, he admitted. Not the night. Sarah looked down at the blanket covering her. Good. I'd hate to think I fed you soup for nothing. He smiled despite himself. The smile faded quickly. I should have looked for you. Sarah turned her head slightly. Why? Because people don't get to save your life and then disappear into nothing. She was silent for a moment. That happens every day, Daniel. Maybe it shouldn't. Sarah watched him carefully, as if deciding how much honesty the moment could bear. When I helped you, she said softly, I wasn't thinking about gratitude. You looked like a man standing too close to the edge. That was all. He remembered that, too. The way she had not questioned his pride, the way she had spoken to him as if he were still a person even while he sat shivering under a borrowed blanket in her old apartment. Back then he had been 25 and furious at the world, humiliated by how quickly one bad season of life could strip a man down to hunger and cold and silence. He had expected judgment. She had offered soup. I know. Sarah gave a small shrug, then winced from the effort. Life doesn't always leave room to keep up with everyone you help. Daniel sat back down. And life didn't leave room for anyone to help you? Something changed in her expression at that. Not defensiveness. Not exactly. Something older. Warier. I had help, she said. When? Different times. Different people. She looked toward the door, then back to him. But help comes and goes. Bills don't. He let that settle. The monitor beside the bed kept its calm rhythm. Where's Marcus's father? Daniel asked carefully. Sarah's gaze hardened, not dramatically, just enough to close one door and open another. Gone. That long? Long enough. Daniel nodded once. He had learned years ago that some answers carried enough finality on their own. And Annie's? Sarah looked away. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Annie's father died when she was 2. She said quietly. Construction accident outside Joliet. Wrong safety harness. Wrong supervisor. Wrong day. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did the company pay? Sarah gave him a look that said she had no energy for rich man questions with easy endings. They paid exactly what the law forced them to pay. There it was, he thought. The old American sentence. The one every poor family learns sooner or later. Exactly what the law forced them to pay. No more. Never more. Sarah's eyes drifted shut for a second, then reopened. I worked after that, she said. Then I worked more. Then I got sick and told myself it was just a cough. She gave a breath that almost became a laugh. Turns out lungs don't care about optimism. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You're not going back to that apartment. She looked at him directly. That wasn't a suggestion, was it? No. A faint smile touched one corner of her mouth. You got bossier. I got older. You got rich. That too. She watched him for several seconds. Then, very softly, she asked, why now? He knew what she meant. Not why the hospital. Not why the room. Why this level of attention? Why this insistence? Why her? Daniel looked at his hands before answering. They rested on his knees, steady now, though that was not how he felt. For years, he said, I told myself that success meant never needing anyone, never depending, never looking back. Sarah listened without interrupting. This morning I heard your daughter asking for leftover pizza. His voice lowered. Then I followed her home and listened through your door, like a man with no manners at all. That drew the slightest laugh from her. Annie always did bring people to the truth faster than they planned. He nodded. I heard the way she spoke to Marcus. The way she spoke to you. He looked up. And I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. What? That the world I built has room for profit, efficiency, growth, strategy. He exhaled slowly. But it has not made enough room for grace. Sarah was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. Grace is expensive. Daniel thought of boardrooms, investors, rivals like Victor Langley, men who would call compassion a liability while billing their cruelty as realism. Yes, he said, I'm beginning to see that. A soft knock came at the door. A nurse stepped inside with Annie and Marcus just behind her. The children stopped the instant they saw their mother awake. Mom? Annie's voice broke on the word. Sarah held out one hand. Annie crossed the room quickly but carefully, as if afraid too much speed might somehow undo the miracle of finding her mother sitting up. Marcus followed at once, climbing onto the edge of the bed with the confident entitlement only small boys possess until the nurse gently redirected him to the chair. Sarah touched Annie's cheek. I'm okay. Annie nodded, but her eyes filled anyway. You scared me. I know. Marcus looked at the monitor. What's that number? It means I'm still here, Sarah said. He seemed satisfied with that and settled against Daniel's leg without asking permission. Exhausted enough to forget caution, Daniel glanced down at the boy, then back at Sarah. She was looking at him over Annie's bent head. There was gratitude in her expression now, yes, but also something else. Recognition, not of the man he had been, of the man he might still choose to become. The hospital room became quieter after visiting hours. By 9 in the evening, most of the lights in the hallway had dimmed, and the steady rhythm of machines replaced the daytime movement of nurses and carts. Outside the wide window, Chicago glowed with winter traffic and distant office towers still lit from late meetings. Inside the room, Marcus had fallen asleep in the reclining chair beside the bed. His red coat had become a blanket, half slipped across his legs. Annie sat near the foot of the bed with a book the nurse had brought from the pediatric waiting shelf. She turned each page carefully, though Daniel suspected she was not really reading. Sarah slept again. The medication had finally quieted the cough that had shaken her lungs all afternoon. Daniel stood near the window with a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Linda Park entered quietly a few minutes later, closing the door behind her. I arranged the apartment, she said in a low voice. Daniel turned slightly. Where? 3 blocks from here. Furnished. 2 bedrooms. That was fast. Linda gave the smallest shrug. Chicago real estate moves faster when your name is on the paperwork. Daniel nodded. Good. Linda glanced toward the bed where Sarah slept. How bad? Serious, Daniel said. But treatable? Yes. Linda exhaled slowly. That's something. Across the room, Annie lifted her head. Is Mom okay? Daniel walked over and crouched beside her chair. She's resting, he said. That's part of getting better. Annie looked relieved, but only a little. Children like Annie didn't trust easy reassurances. They had learned too early that adults often said, everything is fine when it clearly wasn't. Can we stay here tonight? She asked. Daniel looked toward Linda briefly, then back at Annie. Yes. Marcus stirred slightly in the chair but didn't wake. Annie closed her book and set it carefully on the small table. Thank you, she said. Daniel studied her face for a moment. You don't have to thank me every time. Yes, I do. Why? Because Mom says people stop helping when they feel invisible. Daniel leaned back slightly on his heels. That's a very serious idea for someone your age. Annie shrugged. Mom says I listen too much. Linda smiled faintly from across the room. She might be right. For several minutes, the room remained quiet again. Marcus snored softly in the chair. The city lights outside the window flickered across the glass. Finally, Annie spoke again. Mr. Whitmore? Daniel looked at her. You can call me Daniel. She nodded but didn't repeat the name. Instead, she asked the question that had clearly been waiting. Why are you helping us? Daniel expected that question. Children eventually asked it. They wanted the rule explained, the balance of the world clarified. Adults sometimes asked it too, but with suspicion instead of curiosity. Daniel rested one arm on the back of the chair. Your mom helped me once, he said. Annie looked toward the bed. When? A long time ago. Marcus stirred again, half awake. Did she give you pizza? Daniel smiled. No. Then what? Something better. Marcus blinked slowly. What's better than pizza? Daniel thought about that. Hope, he said. Marcus seemed unsure about that answer but accepted it for now and drifted back to sleep. Annie remained quiet. Then she asked, "Are you rich?" Linda coughed softly in the corner. Daniel almost laughed. "Yes." "How rich?" Linda covered her mouth, trying not to react. Daniel leaned closer to Annie. "Rich enough that buying pizza is not a big problem." Annie nodded slowly. "That's good." "Why?" "Because Marcus likes pizza a lot." Daniel glanced at the sleeping boy. "I noticed." A soft knock came at the door. The nurse stepped in. "Mrs. Johnson is waking up again," she said gently. Annie stood immediately. "Can I see her?" For a few minutes. Annie walked carefully to the bedside. Sarah opened her eyes slowly. When she saw Annie standing there, she smiled, though the smile was tired. "You should be asleep," she said. "So should you." Sarah reached for her hand. "You're taking care of Marcus?" "Yes." "And yourself?" "Yes." Sarah looked over Annie's shoulder toward Daniel. "I see he's still here." Daniel stepped closer. "I promised the doctor I wouldn't let your children stage a hospital revolt." Sarah gave a faint laugh that turned into a soft cough. Annie squeezed her hand gently. "Easy." Sarah looked at her daughter with quiet amazement. "You sound like a nurse." "I practiced." Daniel watched the moment without speaking. Something about the way Annie held her mother's hand, careful, steady, protective, reminded him again how thin the distance was between childhood and responsibility in families like this. Sarah noticed his expression. "You see it now," she said softly. "See what?" "How she's been living." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "I tried to shield them." "You did. But you can't shield children from everything." "No," Daniel said quietly. The nurse checked the monitor and adjusted the blanket. "Only a few minutes more," she said. Annie leaned forward slightly. "Mom?" "Yes." "When we leave the hospital, where are we going?" Sarah looked at Daniel. He answered before she could. "Somewhere warm." Annie's eyebrows lifted. "Warmer than our apartment?" "Yes." "Does it have heat?" Daniel smiled gently. "Yes." Annie nodded as though that alone made the future manageable. Marcus suddenly woke with a loud snort. "Did I miss dinner?" The room broke into soft laughter. Even Sarah. Outside the hospital window, the snow had begun falling again across Chicago. Inside the room, something quiet but important had begun to take root. Not charity, not obligation, something steadier. The beginning of a family choosing one another. The next morning, Daniel Whitmore walked into a board meeting with hospital coffee still on his breath and almost no sleep in his system. The conference room on the 32nd floor of Whitmore Foods overlooked downtown Chicago in clean, expensive lines, glass, steel, winter sky. The long walnut table shone under recessed lighting. A tray of pastries sat untouched near the far wall. Assistants moved in and out quietly with tablets and printed folders. Everything in the room reflected order, control, and the kind of wealth that knew how to make itself look effortless. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table. Around him sat the people who helped him run his company. Chief Financial Officer, Operations Director, Legal Counsel, Marketing Head. Regional managers patched in on video screens. And 2 seats down from Daniel, leaning back with practiced ease, sat Victor Langley. Langley was not an official Whitmore executive, but he had become impossible to avoid in recent years. He controlled one of the largest food distribution channels in the Midwest and had been pushing aggressively for a deeper strategic partnership with Whitmore Pizza. He was polished, influential, and always smiling a half-second longer than sincerity required. "Morning, Daniel," Langley said. Daniel nodded once. "Victor." Linda Park sat to Daniel's right, tablet open, expression composed. Normally, Daniel began meetings with numbers, quarterly performance, supply issues, expansion projections. But that morning, before anyone else could speak, he placed both hands on the table and said, "We're making a change." The room quieted, not because Daniel's voice was loud, because it never needed to be. He looked down the table. "Effective immediately. Every Whitmore Pizza location in the city will begin a controlled food recovery program." A few heads tilted. The CFO, Richard Hale, frowned. Daniel continued. "At the end of each business day, unsold but safe food will be packaged and distributed through approved neighborhood partners, churches, shelters, and youth centers." Silence. Then Richard spoke first. "That's a charitable model." "Yes." Richard adjusted his glasses. "We're a restaurant chain, Daniel, not a nonprofit." Victor Langley smiled faintly. saying nothing yet. Watching, Daniel kept his gaze on Richard. We're also a company that throws away enough food every week to feed neighborhoods we pretend not to see. That landed harder than anyone expected. The marketing head shifted in her chair. The legal counsel spoke next. There are liability concerns. Linda answered before Daniel could. We can structure distribution through partner organizations with compliance agreements and food safety waivers. The lawyer nodded slowly. So it's possible. It is, Linda said. Richard still looked unconvinced. Possible isn't the same as profitable. Victor finally leaned forward. There it is, he said smoothly. The real question. Daniel turned his head slightly. Victor folded his hands. You built this company because you understood a basic truth. Emotion is expensive. If you open the door to sentiment-driven policy, you don't just absorb food costs. You create expectations, then dependency, then brand confusion. He smiled politely around the table. Investors hate confusion. Daniel watched him for a moment. Normally, he would have answered with numbers. That had always been the safest language in rooms like this. Instead, he said, a 6-year-old girl asked one of my employees for leftover pizza yesterday. The room went still. Victor's smile faded, though only slightly. Daniel continued. She offered to take crumbs if that was all we had left. No one moved. Richard looked down at the table. The marketing head stopped typing. One of our stores told her to bring money next time, Daniel said, because the shop was not a charity. Victor exhaled through his nose. And you're rebuilding policy around one emotional anecdote? Daniel looked directly at him. No, around a truth. Victor spread one hand casually, which is that there are children in this city who know our logo better than they know the inside of a full refrigerator. Silence again, this time deeper. Daniel let it sit. He wanted the discomfort, wanted these people smart, highly paid, well-dressed people to feel even one fraction of the distance between this room and apartment 2B. Richard cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing? Daniel nodded to Linda. She slid printed packets down the table. A pilot program, Daniel said. 12 city stores. 90 days. Daily tracked inventory recovery. Community distribution through vetted partners. If successful, we expand. The operations director glanced through the papers. This is already mapped out. Yes. When did you do this? Last night. That drew a look from several people. Victor leaned back again. So this is personal. Daniel did not deny it. Yes. Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. Personal decisions make weak companies. Daniel's expression did not change. Cold companies make weak cities. That seemed to surprise even Linda. Victor tapped one finger against the table. With respect, Daniel, that sounds good in a speech, but hunger is not a distribution issue you can solve with leftover slices. No, Daniel said. It's a moral issue we've spent too long pricing like waste. Victor gave a quiet laugh. There it is again. Morality. Always a dangerous word in business. Daniel's voice dropped half a degree, only to people who profit from its absence. The room froze. Victor's face stayed composed, but his eyes sharpened. For a second, the two men looked less like executives and more like duelists who had finally stopped pretending the match was friendly. Richard broke the silence. Daniel, even if the board accepts the pilot, shareholders will ask why now. Daniel thought of Annie wrapping half a sandwich for later, of Marcus wearing his new red coat like treasure, of Sarah saying grace is expensive. Because we can, he said, and because not doing it anymore would say more about this company than any earnings report. The marketing head spoke carefully. If we announce this publicly, the story becomes bigger than food. It becomes social. It already is social, Daniel said. Children don't become hungry in private. No one answered that. He looked around the room, one face at a time. For years, I told myself discipline built everything that mattered. Maybe that was true in the beginning, but discipline without mercy becomes vanity. He paused. And I have no interest in building a vain company. Victor stared at him. Then, lightly, almost conversationally, he said, "This about the woman in the hospital." Daniel did not move. Victor continued. The one from the south side. Linda's posture changed beside him, subtle, but Daniel noticed. What about her? Daniel asked. Victor shrugged. People talk. A billionaire spends the night at Northwestern with a sick woman and 2 children from a housing block. Naturally, people get curious. There it was. Not concern. A probe. A test to see where Daniel was vulnerable. Daniel answered calmly. She once helped me when I needed it. Victor nodded as if that confirmed something. So gratitude is policy now. No, Daniel said. But it was a reminder. A reminder of what? Daniel looked straight at him. That sometimes the people this city overlooks are the only reason men like us ever make it out alive. No one in the room spoke after that. Victor's smile disappeared completely. Richard looked back down at the packet in front of him. Linda broke the silence. If there are no further objections, I'll begin partner outreach by noon. Daniel kept his eyes on Victor. There are no further objections. It was not a question. One by one, heads around the table nodded. Some reluctantly, some thoughtfully, some simply because Daniel Whitmore still controlled the room. Victor did not nod, but he didn't argue again either. The meeting moved on after that to supply chains, vendor contracts, city permits, but the energy had changed. Under the language of commerce, something more human had entered the room, and no one quite knew how to put it back out. When the meeting ended, Victor lingered. The others filed out. Laptops closed. Folders gathered. Linda remained near the door, pretending to review notes while clearly listening. Victor buttoned his coat slowly. "You've changed overnight," he said. Daniel stood by the window, looking out over the city. "No, I remembered something overnight." Victor stepped closer. "Be careful. The world doesn't reward softness." Daniel turned toward him. "Maybe that's the problem." Victor held his gaze for a few seconds, then smiled again, that old polished smile, thinner now. "We'll see." He left. Linda closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither she nor Daniel spoke. Then she said quietly, "He'll push back. I know. He'll look for leverage." Daniel looked out at Chicago again. Somewhere below, beyond the towers and traffic and smoke-colored sky, Annie was probably sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, still trying to be older than 6. "Let him look," Daniel said. Linda studied him. "This is bigger than a pilot program, isn't it?" Daniel answered without turning. "Yes." "What is it then?" He took a slow breath. "A debt," he said. "And maybe the first honest thing I've done with this company in years." By the time Daniel Whitmore returned to Northwestern Memorial that evening, the snow had stopped and Chicago had settled into the gray calm that followed a long winter storm. The hospital lobby was quieter than it had been that morning. The rush of visitors had faded into the slower rhythm of evening nurses and tired families waiting under dimmed lights. Daniel stepped out of the elevator on the pulmonary floor and walked toward Sarah's room. He could hear Marcus before he reached the door, and then the dragon fell into the lava. Annie's voice answered calmly, "That's not how the story goes. It is if the dragon is bad." Daniel paused outside the door for a second, listening. There was laughter inside, real laughter. He pushed the door open gently. Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor beside the hospital bed, using folded napkins as pretend mountains. Annie was perched on the edge of the chair, reading from a children's book Linda had brought earlier. Sarah rested against the pillows, watching them. She looked tired, but different from the day before. Color had returned faintly to her cheeks. When Annie noticed Daniel, she lowered the book. "You're back." Marcus spun around. "Did you bring pizza?" Daniel lifted a small paper bag. "Close." Marcus scrambled to his feet. Inside were 3 grilled cheese sandwiches from the hospital cafe. Marcus inspected them carefully. "These are not pizza." "That's true. But they're good? They're very good." Marcus accepted this logic and immediately took the largest one. Sarah shook her head weakly. "That boy eats like winter is coming." Marcus spoke with his mouth full. "It always is." Even Sarah laughed at that. Daniel set the remaining sandwiches on the tray beside Annie. "You eat too," he told her. She nodded and took a small bite, but Daniel noticed what she did next. She wrapped half of the sandwich carefully in a napkin and placed it in her coat pocket. "For later?" he asked. Annie looked slightly embarrassed. "Just in case." Daniel said nothing, but the sight of that quiet habit, saving food even in a hospital room, settled somewhere deep in his chest. Sarah noticed too. "She's learning to trust things will be there tomorrow," she said softly. Daniel met her eyes. "That takes time." A knock came at the door. Dr. Caldwell entered, tablet in hand. "Evening," he said. Marcus waved enthusiastically with his sandwich. "Hi, doctor." The doctor smiled. "How's our patient?" Sarah shrugged slightly. "Breathing still hurts." "That's normal." He checked the monitor beside the bed. "The antibiotics are working." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That's good news." "It is," Caldwell said. "But recovery will take patience." Sarah looked down at her hands. "Patience I can manage." Dr. Caldwell studied her for a moment. "I'd like you here for several more days." She nodded. Whatever it takes. The doctor turned toward Daniel. Walk with me for a moment. Daniel followed him into the hallway. The door closed softly behind them. Caldwell leaned against the wall. She's stronger than I expected. That's good. Yes, the doctor said, but strength has limits when someone has carried everything alone. Daniel understood the meaning immediately. The kids, he said. Yes. Daniel glanced through the window and the door. Inside, Annie had resumed reading while Marcus pretended the sandwich wrapper was a rocket ship. They won't be alone, Daniel said. Caldwell studied him. I assumed as much. Daniel crossed his arms lightly. Doctor, can I ask something? Of course. What happens after she leaves here? Caldwell didn't answer right away. She'll need weeks of recovery, proper food, warm housing, regular treatment. Daniel nodded. All of that is already arranged. The doctor raised an eyebrow. I had a feeling. Daniel hesitated. There's something else. What? Daniel took a breath. I want to help them long term. Caldwell watched him carefully. Out of gratitude? Yes. And Daniel thought about Annie's careful voice asking if the new place had heat, and because I think they deserve stability. The doctor nodded slowly. That's not the same thing. No, and that difference matters. Daniel looked back through the door again. Do you think Sarah will accept help? Caldwell smiled slightly. She's proud. I noticed. But she's also a mother. The doctor gestured toward the room. When recovery becomes about those two children, pride usually learns how to bend. Daniel nodded quietly. Inside the room, Marcus suddenly pressed his face against the glass window in the door. He waved both hands. Daniel waved back. Caldwell chuckled softly. You've already crossed a line with them, you know. Daniel frowned slightly. What line? The one between kindness and responsibility. Daniel leaned against the wall. I think that line disappeared yesterday. The doctor gave a thoughtful nod. Well, he said, pushing away from the wall. In my experience, the best families are rarely the ones people plan. They returned to the room. Marcus immediately announced, The doctor says Mom is getting better. Caldwell raised both hands. I said, improving. Marcus looked at Daniel. That means better. Daniel smiled. Yes, it does. Sarah watched the scene quietly. When the doctor left, she looked at Daniel again. You're doing too much. Daniel shook his head. No. Yes, she insisted gently. People don't usually rearrange their lives for strangers. Daniel pulled the chair closer to the bed. You're not a stranger. Sarah studied him. That was 15 years ago. Daniel nodded. And it still counted. She looked at Annie and Marcus. They count more. Exactly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah said something very quietly. I'm afraid of what happens when this moment ends. Daniel leaned forward. It won't. Dot. She shook her head. Moments always end. Some do, he said. But some become something else. Sarah looked at him. Like what? Daniel thought for a second. Like a promise. Across the room, Annie was teaching Marcus how to fold the sandwich wrapper into a paper airplane. Marcus launched it across the room. It landed softly against Daniel's shoe. He picked it up and handed it back. Marcus grinned. See? It flies. Daniel nodded. Yes, it did. And for the first time since that morning in the pizza shop, Daniel Whitmore allowed himself to believe that maybe something larger than coincidence had placed that small voice behind him in line. A voice asking for leftover pizza. A voice that had quietly begun changing everything. 3 days later, Sarah Johnson left the hospital in a wheelchair with a wool blanket over her knees and a kind of disbelief on her face she could not quite hide. The morning was cold but bright. Sunlight spilled across the hospital entrance in pale winter bands, catching on the glass doors and the slush melting near the curb. Nurses moved around them with practiced smiles. A volunteer pushed another patient toward a waiting taxi. Somewhere nearby, a radio at the reception desk played an old Sam Cooke song softly enough to sound like memory. Marcus had been talking since breakfast. Does the new place have a couch? Yes, Daniel said. Does it have a TV? Yes. Does it have stairs? No. Marcus looked disappointed for exactly 2 seconds. Does it have snacks? Linda Park, standing beside the car with a clipboard in hand, answered before Daniel could. Yes. Marcus's entire face lit up. That's the best house. Annie said nothing. She walked beside the wheelchair with one hand lightly resting on her mother's shoulder. Not because the chair needed guidance, but because Annie herself did. Daniel had noticed that about her. Marcus ran toward comfort. Annie approached it slowly, like something that might vanish if she trusted it too fast. Sarah looked up at Daniel as they reached the car. You really arranged all this. It was not surprise so much as quiet exhaustion meeting evidence too large to dismiss. Yes, he said. You didn't have to. I know. The driver opened the rear door. Daniel and Linda helped Sarah in carefully. Annie climbed in beside her. Marcus slid in after them, already asking whether the apartment had windows that opened and if there would be real cereal there or just the kind in bags. Daniel got into the front seat. As the car moved away from the hospital, Sarah turned her head and looked back once through the rear window. The movement was small, almost private. Daniel saw it anyway. Do you want to go back? He asked. No, she said. Then, after a pause, I just haven't left a place in a while without worrying what waits on the other side. The city passed around them in winter grays and browns. Downtown glass towers gave way to older brick blocks, then to a quieter neighborhood near Lincoln Park where the sidewalks were cleaner and the trees, though bare, were trimmed. The apartment Daniel had arranged sat on the third floor of a modest red brick building with a pharmacy on the corner and a diner across the street that had likely served the same breakfast for 40 years. When they pulled up, Marcus pressed both palms to the window. This is where rich people live? Linda smiled faintly. Not rich people, just warm people. Marcus accepted that answer. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon cleaner. The place was not extravagant. Daniel had not wanted extravagance. He had wanted safety without spectacle. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with working appliances, new blankets, a dining table, a couch deep enough for real rest. On the counter sat grocery bags Linda had arranged that morning. Soup, bread, fruit, eggs, milk, cereal, crackers, tea. Marcus walked in first and stopped in the middle of the living room as if entering church. Whoa. Annie came in more slowly. She looked at the couch, the curtains, the kitchen light, the radiator under the window. Then she asked the only question that mattered to her. Does the heat stay on? Daniel nodded. All the time. Annie stood very still for a second, and though her face did not change much, something in her shoulders loosened. Sarah lowered herself carefully onto the couch. For several moments she said nothing at all. She just sat there with one hand against the cushion, testing its reality. This is too much, she murmured. No, Daniel said quietly. This is enough. Marcus had already discovered the pantry. There are 3 boxes of macaroni. Linda, still by the door, made a note on her clipboard. I'll add more. Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed. You don't have to keep doing this. Linda answered gently. Actually, I do. He signs my checks. That pulled the first real smile from Sarah since leaving the hospital. For a little while, the apartment filled with ordinary sounds. Cabinet doors opening. Water running in the kitchen. Marcus asking if he could have 1 apple now and maybe another later. Annie folding the hospital blanket before anyone could stop her. Sarah trying twice to stand on her own and being firmly told by both Daniel and Annie to sit back down. It felt, Daniel thought, like the beginning of something fragile and important. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Victor Langley. Daniel let it ring once, twice, then answered. What is it? Victor's voice came smooth and composed. I hear you've gone domestic. Daniel walked toward the window, lowering his voice. I'm busy. Yes, Victor said. So I've heard. New apartment, hospital bills, charitable programs. Very moving. Daniel looked out over the street below where an older couple in heavy coats were waiting to cross at the light. Get to the point. The point, Victor said, is that investors are asking questions. Your board is nervous, and people have started telling a story. Daniel said nothing. Victor continued. A billionaire saves a struggling family from the South Side after discovering the mother once helped him. Beautiful headline. The kind that makes reporters curious about whether compassion is strategy now. Daniel's voice cooled. If you're threatening me, do it clearly. Victor laughed softly. Not threatening, advising. Emotional visibility creates risk. Daniel turned from the window and looked across the room. Marcus was sitting on the floor with a cereal box in his lap, trying to read the back. Annie was in the kitchen pouring water into a kettle because Sarah had coughed twice, and she remembered the nurse saying warm air helped. Sarah herself sat on the couch wrapped in a gray throw, watching both children with the stunned, careful look of a woman unaccustomed to being able to rest, while her children moved through a safe room. Daniel answered without taking his eyes off them. Everything worthwhile creates risk. Victor was silent for a moment. Then, you've changed. No, Daniel said. I've decided not to pretend anymore. He ended the call. When he turned back, Sarah was watching him. Bad news? Just a man who mistakes control for wisdom. That sounds expensive. It usually is. Sarah looked toward Annie in the kitchen. She's pretending not to listen. I know. Annie called from the stove. I'm not pretending. Marcus lifted his head. I'm listening a little. The room laughed. A little later, after Linda left and the groceries were put away, Daniel stood to go. He had stayed longer than he meant to. Long enough for Marcus to decide that the chair by the window was Daniel's chair. Long enough for Annie to stop glancing at him every time he moved. Long enough for Sarah to fall briefly asleep on the couch with her hand still resting near the edge of Marcus's sleeve. At the door, Annie walked with him into the hallway. She stood there in the warm apartment light, small and serious, one hand on the doorknob. Are you coming back? The question was simple, not dramatic, not pleading, but it held the whole weight of what children fear most, that help is temporary, that kindness has an ending built into it. Daniel bent slightly so he was nearer her height. Yes, he said. Tomorrow? Yes. Annie studied his face the way she always did when measuring truth. Then she nodded once. Okay. He started toward the stairs. Behind him, she said, Daniel? He turned. Thank you for not making us feel like a problem. For a moment, the hallway seemed very quiet. Daniel looked at the child in the doorway, the warm apartment behind her, the life that only a few days ago had depended on crumbs and caution. You were never the problem, he said. He left her with that, and as he walked down the stairs and out into the sharp evening air, Daniel Whitmore understood that the real test of a man's character was not whether he could rise from hardship. It was whether, after rising, he remembered to reach back. 7 months later, the stone bench outside Whitmore Pizza on Clark Street had a small brass plaque fixed to its side. Most people walking past never noticed it. It was simple, just one line. For the day, a small voice reminded us what hunger really sounds like. Autumn sunlight filtered through the trees along the sidewalk, scattering gold leaves across the pavement. Chicago had softened after summer. The wind was cooler now, but not yet cruel the way winter would eventually become. Inside the restaurant, the afternoon crowd was steady. Families, construction workers, office employees grabbing late lunches, and near the front counter, Annie Johnson stood on a small stool beside the register. She was 7 now. Her hair was tied back in a careful braid she had learned to do herself. She wore a red sweater that Sarah insisted made her look official, though Annie claimed it was simply warm. Marcus sat in a booth nearby with a comic book and a slice of pizza that had already lost most of its cheese to enthusiastic eating. On the wall behind the counter hung a framed photograph. It showed 2 old yellow rubber gloves, the kind used for washing dishes and scrubbing floors. Beneath the photo was another small plaque, hands that worked before anyone noticed. Customers often asked about it, and Annie always answered the same way. They remind us that people who work quietly are still important. That had become part of the story now. Not the whole story, but the beginning. Across the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore stood near the window talking with the store manager. His suit jacket hung over one arm, tie loosened slightly. The past several months had changed the rhythm of his life in ways even his closest executives had not expected. The food recovery program had expanded from 12 stores to nearly every Whitmore Pizza location in the Midwest. Every night, surplus food moved quietly into shelters, churches, and community kitchens. The numbers surprised even the accountants. Thousands of meals each week. Food that used to become trash now became dinner. At first, investors had worried. Victor Langley had certainly warned them. But something unexpected happened. Customers noticed. Communities noticed. And slowly, the company's reputation changed. Not louder, not more profitable in obvious ways, but stronger. Stronger in the quiet way that trust builds when people believe you are not pretending anymore. Victor Langley still operated his distribution empire across the city. He still competed aggressively, but he had stopped making public comments about Whitmore's sentimental policies. Because the truth was simple. The program worked. Daniel finished speaking with the manager and walked toward the counter. Annie saw him first. You're late. Daniel checked his watch. 3 minutes. That's late. Marcus looked up from his booth. Did you bring anything? Daniel placed a small paper bag on the counter. Marcus ran over. Inside were 2 chocolate chip cookies. Victory, Marcus announced. Sarah appeared from the back kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She moved slowly still, but the cough had almost disappeared now. The months of treatment, proper food, and rest had given her back something she thought she might never recover again. Energy, life. She leaned against the counter. "You're spoiling him." Marcus shook his head with great seriousness. "I'm being supported." Daniel laughed. Sarah studied him quietly. "You've been busy. Company stuff. Saving the city one pizza at a time? Something like that." Sarah folded her arms. "You know you didn't have to keep coming here every afternoon." Daniel glanced around the restaurant. Employees moved through the kitchen. Customers talked at tables. Annie rang up a man buying 2 slices and a soda with calm concentration. "Yes," Daniel said. "I did." Sarah smiled faintly. "Still paying an old debt?" Daniel shook his head. "No." "Then what?" He looked toward Annie and Marcus. "Building something." Sarah followed his gaze. "Looks like you are." Outside, the autumn wind lifted a handful of leaves across the sidewalk. A little later, Annie carried a pizza box to a table near the window where an elderly man sat alone. She placed the box down carefully. "That one's from yesterday," she told him. The man looked confused. "I didn't order anything." "That's okay," Annie said gently. "Sometimes people just need lunch." The man hesitated. Then he nodded and opened the box. Daniel watched the exchange from across the room. Sarah noticed. "You're thinking again." "I do that sometimes." "What about?" Daniel took a slow breath. "About how strange it is." "What is?" "That everything started with one question." Sarah looked curious. "What question?" Across the restaurant, Annie laughed as Marcus tried to balance 2 slices of pizza at once. Daniel remembered the voice behind him in the pizza line months earlier. "Small, Polita. Careful. Do you have any pizza left from yesterday, sir?" He said the words aloud. Sarah nodded slowly. "That question saved us." Daniel looked out the window toward the street. "Maybe it saved me too." At that moment, Marcus ran back to the counter. "Daniel," Annie says, "I have to share." "That sounds fair." Marcus thought about this carefully. Then he handed Daniel half of a cookie. "Okay. But only because you bought them." Daniel accepted it. Outside, the wind carried another swirl of leaves past the restaurant windows. Inside, the warmth of ovens and voices filled the room. And for the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore stood in the middle of something that had nothing to do with power or money. Just a small family, a busy pizza shop, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the people who seem to have nothing are the ones who give the world its most important reminders. Sometimes love does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in on tired feet, asks for yesterday's pizza, and changes everything. The story reminds us that true kindness often begins with the smallest moments. A simple question from a hungry child asking for yesterday's pizza reveals a deeper truth about the world around us. Many people struggle quietly, unseen by those who pass them every day. The lesson is that compassion should not depend on wealth, status, or convenience. Sometimes the greatest change begins when someone chooses to notice, to listen, and to care. Gratitude, empathy, and the courage to help others can transform not only the lives of those in need, but also the hearts of those who choose to give. In the end, real strength is not measured by power or success, but by how we treat the most vulnerable people around us. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.